Good afternoon, everyone. I think we'll get started. On behalf of the team at the archives, in particular Ravi, Sonia, Neha, Manasi, Aditi, and Sanjana, who's not here today, I welcome you all to the 50th edition of the Archives Public Lecture Series. The credit goes to all of you for sticking around for the last 2 years. For those of you who are, still unfamiliar with this forum and what it does, just a quick note. Apologies for those of you who have heard it 50 times. The Archive at NCBS is a public center for the history of science in contemporary India. My name is Venkat Srinivasan. I'm part of the team at the Archive, and it's a delight to have you all for this public lecture. Our first lecture at Dasheri since the lockdown in the last year. So really excited to see so many of you turn up on a Friday evening. There are 4 broad functions for the archive. One is to think of it as a research center for the history of science in contemporary India. The second is to think about archival research in the country. The third is to build capacity using different modes of education. And the fourth, the public lecture series as a part of that, is to reimagine public engagement with the idea of an archive and sort of rethink archives as part of the commons, so to speak. We've done these lectures over the last 4 years for a variety of purposes. These lecture series started a year before the public opening of the archive, and you'll see a few of the posters that have been shown on the screen. I know many people in the audience and many people have come to us and said that very often, as much as the talk, they look forward to the poster itself. It's really nice to hear, and the credit for that I should stress goes out to 3 designers. Aditi, who worked on the first of the posters through 2020, I'm not mistaken. Neha, who worked on the posters in 2020 as the seed, and Nana, who worked on one of the earlier posters in 2018, I'm not mistaken. So thank you guys for doing this. Your posters make it possible and make people interested in the talk as much as the speaker. The series, just to give some context, started initially as a series around the history of biology. Is what we thought we would do. We thought we'd focus on biology in the archives. Then we thought that's too narrow, and we thought let's take it broader and think about history of science. And after a point, we thought again, for a city, we are in a position to do something broader. And so over the last year or 2 years, it's become a broader history of ideas series, and we'd like to think of this as a forum that promotes dialogue and debate between the speaker, between members of the audience, and so we do hope to sort of take that spirit forward today as well. I also want to give a shout out to 4 collaborating institutions that have been part of the series in the last 4 years. That's the King's University, IIIT Bangalore, the Center for Public History at Tricity, St. Joseph's College, and for your 5th IISc, where we were privileged to host the original IIS talk earlier this year. I feel really, really silly to have to introduce Ram to this audience of people who know him probably far, far better than I do. But I'm going to try and do some justice to his extraordinary body of work. And I'm really delighted and honored that you're looking through this talk today. As many of you obviously know, Ram is a historian and a biographer based in Bangalore. His books really span a wide range of topics, including the pioneering environmental history work, Unquiet Woods, which came out in 1989. And the award-winning social history of cricket, A Corner for Foreign Team, which came out in 2002. That book was chosen by Guardian as one of the 10 best books on cricket ever written. His book, India After Gandhi, was chosen as Book of the Year by The Economist, The Washington Post, and The Wall Street Journal, and was Book of the Decade in the Times of London and The Hindu. This book was followed by Gandhi Before India in 2014, and Gandhi, The Years That Changed the World in 2018. More recently, this year, he published Rebels Against Raj, Western Fighters for India's Freedom. There's a whole range of awards that I could describe, but I think I find it particularly interesting that the people who are awarded also span a variety of disciplines. He's been awarded by the American Society of Environmental History. He's been given the Delhi Telegraph Cricket Society Prize, the Malcolm Ali Sethi Award for Excellence in Social Science Research, the Ramachandra Guha Prize for Excellence in Journalism, the Sahitya Academy Award, and the Fukuoka Prize for contributions to Asian studies. It's really an honor for that you're able to do this talk today. And since we are in the age of people taking offense and being penalized for that. I just want to put on a lighter note say that the title of being an archive rat came from Ram. So over to you.
Thank you all, and thank you, Venkat, for this most generous introduction. I didn't tell Venkat, but about 4 or 5 days ago, I got an anguished mail from a former student now in Auckland, New Zealand, saying, "Sir, I was offended by this lecture announcement. Why have they called you an archive rat? Rat? Do they have your permission?" And he's a very sweet, sensitive boy from from a completely non-intellectual family who totally made his way through his struggle from a small town in UP. And I've been following his journey for many, many years. So I went online and Googled archive rat, nothing came up. Then I was slightly wiser and I put double inverted commas on both sides. And a few articles came up because this is a term that's been in use among historians for a few years. And a few articles came up, including an interview with Drew Gilpin Faust, the first female president of Harvard University. And the title of the interview in the Harvard Crimson or the Boston Globe, I forget which, was "New President of Harvard University is a self-confessed archive rat." So my student was then assured that Venkat had not gratuitously insulted me by calling me an archive rat. Okay. I'm delighted to be here. I'm a great, shall we say, if I may use the word, bhakt of NCBS. From the time one of my all-time intellectual heroes, we established it. I love coming here. It's not quite my favorite place in Bangalore. Koshi's and the Chinnaswamy Stadium take precedence, and a few bookshops too, but it's still one of the places I like most to come. Now, it's usually historians who go to archives, whether historians of science, of politics, of culture, of ecology, etc. And one of the, how do I put it? One of the worst kept secrets about me is that I've never studied history in my life. I'm a professional historian. I've written books, which I describe, all based on research in the archives. But I last studied history in middle school. I was a science major in high school. Then I studied economics and then went on to sociology. And I'll describe how I became a historian. But the transition is interesting because scientists are lab rats. I was passable in chemistry, but I could have done that in college, but there were two problems. One was that I was an asthmatic and the fumes kind of affected me. And the other and more serious problem was that if in those days, as some people in this audience, including Jitu, found out, if you did science in university, you could not play cricket because practicals were in the afternoon and college cricket team practice was also in the afternoon. So I decided to do economics, about which I knew nothing at all when I registered for a degree in economics in Delhi University. And I played 5 years of cricket, not very successfully. In fact, one of my greatest ambitions, which I'm finally fulfilling now, was to score 50. I was a bowler, and I vividly recall my highest score, which was 49 in inter-college match, and how I got out. I won't give you the details. But when Venkat said, "Yours is going to be the 50th talk in this series," that was an additional reason to accept. So I did economics. Now, indifferently, but those of you who studied economics know that it has nothing to do with human beings or non-human beings either. I should say that in the NCBS, because NCBS also rarely has done human beings, but at least they look at the non-human world. It has to do with equations, abstractions, statistics, and so on. In my MA, which was in the University of Delhi, I discovered the works of the anthropologist Very Arvind, who was an Englishman who made his home among the Adivasis of central India and wrote a series of incredibly evocative ethnographies about them. And I said, oh, maybe, I can become a sociologist or an anthropologist. There's some hope there. It's about human beings. And, I come from kind of, my father was a scientist, so I thought, I can't do chemistry like him, but let me at least try and do sociology. And I moved to Calcutta to start a PhD in sociology. Now, there's a kind of I beg your pardon. There's a kind of methodological fetishism among social science disciplines. Economists look at statistics or equations. Historians go to the archive. Political scientists also look at statistics and equations. They have what we may call economist envy. Sociologists do field work. Sociologists and anthropologists do field work. So that's a kind of very clear disciplinary distinction made in the academy, and not just the Indian academy. But in the Indian academy, there was a more kind of problematic distinction between sociology and history. And it was as follows. When the clock struck midnight on the 14th, 15th of August, 1947, history ended and political science and sociology began. So sociologists were not supposed to look at the past. They were supposed to look at the present. And I was doing this PhD in sociology in Calcutta, and I had to find a topic which involved my immersing myself in the lives of some group of people. It could be workers, it could be artisans, it could be business professionals, it could be scientists. I don't know whether NCBS has as yet had an ethnographer following them around their labs, but these kinds of things are done in different parts of the world. So I, for a variety of reasons which I won't go into here, partly autobiographical, the fact that I grew up in Dehradun in the Himalayan foothills, decided to write a sociology of the Chipko movement. I began my PhD in 1980, and the Chipko movement had begun about a decade previously, and it was just unfolding. So it's actually studying a live movement as it's taking shape and going in different directions. So my original idea was that I look at the different, and there was a kind of in the old days, by old days I mean the 50s and 60s, when Indian sociology and anthropology was finding its feet, the method followed was that of village studies. So you went for a full year in a village and stayed there. Now people were talking very fashionably about multi-sited ethnography. So I said, okay, I will do multi-sited ethnography. I will do some research in Garhwal, some in Kumaon, some in the foothills. And so I'll cover the different parts of what was not then Uttarakhand, but what was to be known as Uttarakhand, which had witnessed protests against state reservation of forests, following a kind of Chipko model. So that was the idea. I was going to do field work. And I began by visiting a village called Mandal, which is in the upper Alaknanda Valley. Now, if you follow the course of the Ganga up from Rishikesh, I mean, some of you would have been to Rishikesh, some of you would have gone even further ahead, and some of you would have attended the wonderful and unsurpassed talks in this hall by the great Uttarakhandi historian Shekhar Pathak. So you would know something about the landscape of that region. So if you follow the Ganga from Rishikesh up to Devprayag, then cross over and follow the Alaknanda, which is the eastern tributary, leave the Bhagirathi behind you, and go right up. You come to a town called Chamoli, which is on the left bank. You cross over to Gopeshwar, which is on the right bank. And a little ahead of Gopeshwar, it's a few miles from Gopeshwar, is a village called Mandal, which was in the ancient pilgrim route, where you actually walked to Badrinath. You didn't go the way you do now. So you actually had a much more gentle ecological footprint, if we might say. This village of Mandal had now been bypassed by the road, but it is where the first Chipko agitation took place on the 27th of March, 1973. Next March, we will celebrate the 50th anniversary of the origins of the Chipko movement. So I went to Mandal, where the first agitation took place, to meet the headman of the village, Alam Singh Bisht, who had been involved in organizing his fellow villagers to threaten to hug the trees. They actually never hug the trees. I mean, all pictures you see of Chipko of women hugging trees are posed. That actually never happened. They just congregated in the forest and said, we will not go, told the loggers we will not go. And if you come with your axes, we'll hug the trees. So I asked him, I was talking to him about the origins of this movement, Alam Singh Bisht, the headman of Mandal village. And I remember the scene, you know, in its minutest detail. We were sitting on a large boulder, looking down on the Alaknanda below us. And he told me in Hindi, he said, all these protests didn't start on March 27, 1973. Long ago, 50 years before that, my ancestors started protesting against government takeover of forests. In my grandfather's generation, there was a commissioner called Wyndham who came to this area and said, the Sarkar is taking over the forests. And we said, absolutely not. And when we insisted, we said, okay, we will show you what happens to people who take over our forests, which are our sustenance, our livelihood, you know, our source of everything. He said, my grandfather and his friends or his colleagues got hold of Wyndham, put him on painted his face black, put him on a donkey, put him upside down on a donkey and sent him out of the district. That's an extraordinary story, right? And I heard this story and I said, wow. Now, a little later, I thought, let me look at what the archives say about not this incident, but I was looking for really materials on why the British colonial government decided to take over the then very extensive and extremely diverse multi-species forests of the Uttarakhand Himalaya. And I went with a friend I'd never entered the National Archive. And I asked a friend, incidentally, also whose surname is Guha, Shumit Guha, now a distinguished historian of medieval and early modern India. I said, just take me to the archive to see. I know I've been trained how to do field work. How do you go to do archival work? So he took me to the National Archives, which may now have become a victim of Central Vista, I'm not sure. He took me to the old ancient reading room and showed me how to use it. So what is there in the archives is you have large files for every year for every department. So there's a file for education, health, 1921, etc., 22, 23, revenue and commerce, agriculture, home. And the file, you open that volume, I beg your pardon, there's a volume for each year. You open that volume and all the files of that year are listed by subject. So it will say, for example, agriculture, it will say failure of rains and drought in Khandesh province of central, Khandesh districts of central provinces, and failure of cotton crop, and it'll give a file number. And then you order that file, and then you see what's there. Now, there was also a department called Foreign and Political in the old National Archives repository. This dealt with the princely states, and part of Uttarakhand was ruled by the Maharaja of Tehri Garhwal. This is the western part, which is the Bhagirathi Valley, and the eastern part was under the British. And I went looking also, because I was also interested in Tehri Garhwal. As I said, I wanted to do multi-site ethnography, and Tehri Garhwal was where one of the major TIPCO leaders, Sundarlal Bahuguna, was active. So I started looking at foreign and political, and I found an index entry in the foreign and political records under Tehri Garhwal saying, forest affray near the Chandrabadni temple, 1906. So I ordered the file and it came out. This and one paragraph in this file read. Now this is a verbatim transcription of that paragraph which appears in my book. I'll just read it out to you so that you can link it to what I've told you before. So this paragraph read, it is reported that the villagers both then and previously had taken exception to the reservation of these forests, but it was not supposed that their objections would extend beyond the refusal of supplies and petty obstructions. On the morning of the 28th December 1906, however, about 200 villagers armed with sticks assembled at the camping ground where the officials' tents were pitched and objected to any state interference with forests over which they claimed full and exclusive rights. They attacked the conservator against whom they are alleged to have a special grudge for introducing unaccustomed forest customs and regulations. It is reported that they beat him, branded him with a hot iron, tore down his tents, pillaged his baggage, and took away and broke his guns. He is represented as having escaped with much difficulty. Now, I read this and it's really what an epiphanic moment, because the parallels with the tale told to me by the village headman of Mandal, Alam Singh Bish, was striking. There were some discrepancies. The event took place in 1906, not 1920s, as Mr. Bishter told me. The official attack was not an Englishman called Wyndham, but an Indian called Keshavanand Bamdine. And the event took place not in the Alaknanda Valley, which is one side of the Ganga, but the Bhagirathi Valley on the west, which was under the Thierry Garhwal Maharaja and not ruled by the British. Now, it's very interesting. The event is passing from history to folk memory, from generation to generation. And it moves forward in time from 1906 to 1920 and eastward in space. So actually it took place in the Bhagirathi Valley, but now it's remembered as taking place in the Alaknanda Valley. And naturally, given the nationalist propaganda of the post-colonial state, it was an Englishman who had been branded with a cattle iron, not a fellow Indian. But the parallels were extraordinary. And I said, look, I must dig more in the archives. I must find out more. And that file, which I found in the foreign and political records of the National Archives, began a thrilling journey which has not ended 40 some years later. I became much more of a historian than a sociologist, using unpublished documents rather than field encounters as my primary research interests. And I must confess, this move from fieldwork to archival research was only partly motivated by intellectual curiosity. It was partly a consequence of temperamental unfittedness. Documents don't talk back. And I found working in the archive much easier and much more congenial to the kind of person I was than actually doing fieldwork. So as Jitu Abekman, as Venkat told you, I've written different kinds of books. I've worked on the history of forests, the history of sport, the history of nationalism. I've written biographies of activists, scholars, and freedom fighters. But what you write, all these different sorts of books, and that is that they're all based on extensive research in the archives. On material not accessible on the internet. I'd like to underline pretty by young people, and I might come back to this question of, internet research in inverted commas, and what kind of internet research is possible or feasible or desirable. So all the books I've written over the last 40 years have been largely, not wholly, there's been the occasional interview to pad things up, to make it more colorful, but have been based on research in the archives in different countries and continents. Now, this is not principally an audience of historians. So let me explain for you the different sorts of archives and primary sources that I've consulted over the course of these 4 decades. So just a kind of a classification of different kinds of archives. And I made for this talk, I made a 5-fold classification. I mean, you could add a 6th and a 7th category to it, but 5 basic kinds of archival sources in terms of theme. And then I'll come to kinds of archival sources in terms of geography and location. So first is the first kind of archival material that I've used, that I should say something very briefly. I'm a historian of the 19th and 20th century. A talk by the archive rat, who actually works in the medieval period, will have different kinds of, materials and sources to discuss. So for a historian of the modern and contemporary period, broadly, there are 5 kinds of archives. The first consists of the unpublished records of the state. Now, the colonial and the post-colonial states. And in India, I talked about the National Archives. The National Archives are supposed to house the records of the central government, based in Calcutta until in 1911, and then, of course, in Delhi thereafter. Then you have provincial archives. So You have, for example, the Karnataka State Archive, which is in the bowels of the Vidhan Sabha, or you have the Maharashtra State Archives, which used to be the Bombay Presidency Archives on the first floor of Elphinstone College in Kalagoda. So you have the National Archive for the central government. You have state or provincial archives for the records of that province or state, official records, Sarkari records. And finally, in some states, not all, you have regional archives, which contain the records of 3 or 4 districts that constitute that region. Fortunately, UP had a regional archive. And in the course of my research, I worked a great deal in these different kinds of archives. I'll just give you a couple of examples. I've mentioned a nugget from the National Archives. There are many more I could talk about, but I'll pass. Let me say a little bit about some of my findings in the Maharashtra State Archives, which from a period much later, some 30 years after my work on Uttarakhand. This is when I was working on my biography of Gandhi. Now, biographers of Gandhi, many biographers of Gandhi, have principally relied on his collected works, which are 97 volumes. That takes you quite a long time to go through them. But I realized that if I wanted to do a really interesting study, I had to look at Gandhi from all angles, and I had to look at many different kinds of sources than just his own writings or just the records in the National Archives or what was called the Home Political Department. So I went to the provincial archives, and I found a fascinating file in Lucknow, in the UP archives, about the speech he made in Banaras in 1916. But much more substantially, I found a whole series of forgotten, unused records in the Maharashtra State Archives dealing with Gandhi's prison terms. So Gandhi was living in Ahmedabad between 1915 and when he went on the Salt March in 1930. And later he moved to Sevagram, of course, but he spent much time. Ahmedabad was in the Bombay Presidency, and so were the jails in which he was housed, mostly the Yerawada prison in Pune, where he was housed between 22 and 24, episodically in the 1930s, and from August 1942 till November 1944. And here were the records of Gandhi in jail, who he was meeting, whom he was not allowed to meet. What happened on his birthday when a procession came to the gates of the jail and they were turned off? What was the slogan shouted? This is stuff in the 20s and 30s. How he felt seriously ill in the 20s and had to be released. Commentary about him, how the British were alarmed when it was reported in a paper that he might get the Nobel Prize, Peace Prize. Of course, he never got it. But the alarm and embarrassment that would ensue to the colonial state if this renegade prisoner was actually awarded the prestigious Nobel Prize. And then moving on to the 40s, some of the most moving and poignant records in the Maharashtra State Archive were of Kasturba's last illness. So daily medical reports, who was coming to see her, what were they saying? That Gandhi is fast, where he almost died. And it was, what would happen if Gandhi died in jail? Would there be a mass uprising, right? And so again, letters going back and forth in different departments of the Bombay Presidency. So that's how the stuff I found in state archives. But in regional archives, I mean, it's in Dehradun had a regional archive, and here you got meticulous reports on so-called forest crimes. A whole dossier on after the state had taken over the forests and how the villagers were defying the regulations by going in at night, by bribing a forest guard, by threatening them with intimidation, by setting fire to a forest rest house. The different ways in which peasants historically have protested expropriation and extraction by the state. So this public records, the records of the national, provincial, and even district governments can show rich and fascinating light, not just on political history and administrative history, but also sometimes on social history, on the lives of ordinary people, and so the lives of extraordinary people too, like Gandhi. So that's the first basic kind of archival collection, the records of the state. The second basic kind of archival source are the personal collections of individuals. That's something which, of course, your archive here with Venkat and his team is doing so well. The records of Krishnan, Swaminathan, etc., Siddiqui, etc., right? And where you have the personal and the professional correspondence of individuals who've led interesting or important or controversial lives. And the NCBS is, I'll come to it in a minute, but the most important collection of individual papers is in the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, which is a public archive. It's a state archive owned and run by the government of India, but containing not government records, but the records of individuals. It was set up after Nehru's death by a visionary education minister called M.C. Chagla, who was a quite remarkable man who deserves a biography of his own. He was a jurist, a scholar, a writer, an educationist, and a great patriot, an opponent of the emergency, and many other things besides. And he thought that the best way to pay tribute to Nehru would be to start an archive, library and archive in his memory, which began with collecting the records of freedom fighters, and then expanded to sourcing and classifying and indexing and making available to scholars the collections of scientists, artists, bureaucrats, diplomats, and all kinds of people. I mean, there's more than 500 collections. It's an extraordinarily rich window, particularly into the history of India after 1947. And the National Archives are much better for the period before 1947. And for contemporary history, it's really the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library that is our finest and most extensive repertory. And I've spent years and years of my life there. For a long time, I would go 4 or 5 times a year from Bangalore and spend 2-3 weeks each time. And it's really my favorite archive because of the setting. Some of you have been to Tirumurti House. Peacocks calling outside, great bird life, grey hornbills going from one tree to another. First class staff, till very recently staffed by outstandingly competent and capable individuals who are extremely knowledgeable and helpful. My book on Elvin extensively used, the anthropologist Elvin extensively used the papers of Elvin himself. India after Gandhi could not have been written without the Nehru Museum. The Nehru Museum had the papers of P.N. Huxar, who was worked with Indira Gandhi and was the closest advisor through the period of the Bangladesh war right up to the emergency. The papers of C. Rajagopalachari, of many other influential and important people. And without Tirumurti, I could not have written that book. With Gandhi too, it has a great collection of Gandhi papers, people close to Gandhi, Gandhi's own correspondence. And so that's the second kind of archival repository, a public archive containing private papers. And I suppose in some ways, NCBS counts as that. The third kind of archival repository is the papers, institutional papers held in that institution itself. I see that one of your previous talks was by P. Balram of the Indian Institute of Science, and his history of the Institute of Science is largely based on the papers held by the institute, which of course he did himself as director, he did a fantastic job of retrieving, rehabilitating, classifying, and so on. So the records of companies, religious bodies, universities, as held by these institutions themselves. And I've had some gloriously enjoyable and educative experiences working in such institutions. Of course, most obviously the Sabarmati Ashram in Ahmedabad, which contains all the letters to Gandhi. So the collected works, not all, as many letters to Gandhi as can be retrieved. The collected works has all the letters written by Gandhi, but you want to know who was writing to him. And the Sabarmati Ashram has it. It also has exemplary archivists, or till very recently. Again, a place with great historic associations, a joy to work there. But let me tell you the kind of story, the kind of human personal encounter one has while working in these archives. One of the small archives I worked in when writing a biography of Elvin was in a small monastery in a remote part of England. It was called the Hillfield Priory. And there was a monk there with whom Elwin had an extensive correspondence. Elwin was kind of a lapsed Christian who became a Buddhist, but was deeply interested in heterodox Christianity, as was this monk in the Hillfield Priory in Dorset. And I went to that many years ago. I wrote to the curator. I forget, not the curator. They didn't really have a curator. I wrote to someone in that monastery, and they said, please come. This is the early 90s. They said, we'll meet you at this train, which leaves London at 11, comes at 11:40. We'll take you, we'll put you up for 2 days. Now, in those 2 days, the food was, I mean, Elwin, I should have brought this here at this moment, but it's there in my book. Elwin loved Gandhi and the Sabarmati Ashram, but he detested the food. He wrote a poem about it on ashramatic food. And what Jeeves would have thought of it if Bertie Wooster was serving the kind of food that Gandhi and his colleagues ate. Now, it turned out that this is common not just among Hindu monks, but among Christian monks too. And in those 2 days in the Hillfield Priory, I had the most boring, bland, pathetic food, though the archival sources were incredibly rich. But on the way there, so these two monks with beards and exuding empathy and spirituality, really wonderful people, met me at the station, drove me towards out of the town to the countryside, and on top of a hill was that monastery. And they said, it's always the road gets narrower and narrower till you reach the top, because that's the search for God. But at the bottom of the hill, they said, excuse me, do you mind if we stop for a moment? And we stopped at a small kirana dukan at the bottom of the hill. And one monk went in, the other was in the car. And he came out with 3 magnum bars of ice cream. And he said, the food up there is rather bad. So here's one for you, and here's one for each of us. Right. So you have these kind of encounters, human personal encounters, apart from the kind of material you find. So I worked in company archives, in university archives. So the archives of institutions, as held by those institutions, are a third important and significant kind of archival source. The fourth kind of archival source that historians like myself are interested in are the collections of individuals, but held in personal hands. Sometimes the family will not donate the papers to the Nehru Museum or to NCBS because they don't know what to do with it. They don't know what's in it. Could there be some, romantic correspondence that throws a kind of light on their father or mother they don't want to be made public? They're too nervous to look at the papers. They're too respectful to burn it. They don't have the time to source through it, and it's just lying somewhere, right? So this is the kind of thing that often happens. Or there's a quarrel about family members. One says, "Dikha do." The other person says, "Don't know what you write about dad, yeah?" Right. So that's the kind of thing that happens often. And I was able to find a fabulous collection of papers in Bangalore belonging to the communist turned libertarian Philip Spratt, who's one of the heroes of my last book, Rebels Against the Raj. And these were incredibly moving. These were held by his youngest son. Fortunately, the other siblings were in Ahmedabad, Gurgaon, Somerset, and somewhere even further away, respectively. So he didn't even consult them. He said, you can have a look at them. And they were his letters from jail to his wife, actually to someone who was not yet his wife. So the story of Spratt, which is compelling by itself, is of an Englishman who's a communist, comes to India, meets the grandniece of a famous Tamil communist called Singaravelu Chettiar, falls in love with her, is imprisoned, writes her these letters from jail, and later comes out and marries her, and so on. And these letters from Spratt to his wife Sita were beautifully written, moving, evocative. And Spratt was the kind of Englishman who didn't speak very much and liked to express himself, through correspondence. And these were held by the family. So this is true of many other biographers too, that they're often lacking a certain set of papers that are not in an easily accessible public or institutional archive. And finally, they have to persuade the personal keeper of the flame to hand it over. In fact, there's a wonderful history of biographers and biography writing by the British writer Ian Hamilton, which is called Keepers of the Flame, which is as much about biographers and their subjects as about people who hoard their collections. I will just tell you one last remark about this. Gandhi had a secretary called Pyarelal, and he had a large collection of Gandhi papers he wouldn't hand over to anyone, even to the editor of the collected works, who was a famous English professor called K. Swaminathan. And when the writer Ved Mehta came to interview K. Swaminathan about the collected works, he said, one problem is we have stuff everywhere, but letters from Pyarelal, we have to ask him, and he gives us one document at a time. And he said, this is his exact words, he was a professor of English literature, Swaminathan, the editor of the collected works, he said, when it comes to Gandhi, Pyarelal is like Othello guarding Desdemona. Right. So it's really a huge thing if you get access to a collection like I did with the Spratt papers. So I've talked about 4 kinds of archives: public archives, individual papers held in, public hands, institutional papers held by those institutions themselves, and private papers in the safe and sometimes excessively safe custody of the family. And finally, you have newspapers, which are actually a kind of primary source. My book, A Column of Foreign Field, could not have been written without the great and now sadly defunct newspaper, the Bombay Chronicle, which covered cricket and its politics extensively. And that my book is woven around the story of 4 cricketers, 4 brothers from a Dalit background who left no papers of their own. So I think newspapers can be an incredibly rich kind of primary source, and you have to, sometimes those runs do not exist. Often an individual has them. The newspaper has gone defunct, and the grandson of the owner and proprietor may have a series of copies somewhere. Sometimes they'll be in a public archive. Now, I will very quickly move on to the next part of my talk and say a little bit about just the geographical location of the archives I've been a rat in. My 2 favorite archives, one is the Nehru Museum, which I've talked about, and the other is the British Library in London, which has an extensive collection of public and private papers. And again, most professionally run archive. And I could tell stories of what I found there, but that will take us rather too long. But I've also worked in countries other than India and England. So in India and England, they're the 2 countries in which a historian like me does the bulk of his archival research. So apart from the National Archives and the Nehru Museum in Delhi, there'll be the state archives, there'll be the provincial archives, there'll be the institutional papers, spread across India, there'll be the Sabarmati Ashram in Ahmedabad and so on. In England, I worked or in the United Kingdom, I worked in the British Library most extensively, but also in the National Library of Scotland, in Oxford, Cambridge, other university collections, and so on. But I've also worked in countries other than India and Europe, and sometimes found the richest or strangest finds in these places. And I'll very quickly recount my experiences working in 4 archives in 4 different countries other than India or England. First, just a brief recollection of the weeks I spent in the Swarthmore Peace Archive. Swarthmore College in rural Pennsylvania was established by the Quakers. And Gandhi had many Quaker friends. And Swarthmore has since collected the papers of many peacemakers who happened to be Quakers. And several of them worked with Gandhi. They had their correspondence with Gandhi is very revealing about Gandhi's politics, his religious reform, his anti-untouchability movement, and also about his sexuality, as it turns out. Gandhi's most bizarre experiments conducted in 1946 in Noakhali, which is Randy's. If you want to really understand the kind of psychology of those experiments, these papers have first-hand accounts of what Manu Gandhi, Gandhi's grandees, told one of these Quakers about it. So that's one archive, and the details are in my book. Then the South African archives, where I had to work essentially for Gandhi. And there too, I mean, there was this very moving correspondence between Gandhi and the daughter of his first biographer, a Christian priest called Joseph Doak, who, in whose home Gandhi recovered after the first assassination attempt on him. And Gandhi had 4 sons and no daughter, and Olive Doak became a kind of surrogate daughter for him. And those letters were not in the collected works. And I found them in a small, obscure archive in Pretoria. I also went, as in the course of working on Gandhi, to Israel, to the town of Haifa on the port, on the seaside, where there were the papers of Gandhi's close Jewish friend, Herman Kallenbach. Herman Kallenbach was an architect who shared a home with Gandhi in Johannesburg in 1906, 1907, was his closest friend at that time, at least closest European friend at that time. Was a prosperous man who donated his land to Gandhi. Tolstoy farm came up on land owned by Kallenbach, and wanted to come back with Gandhi in 1914-15, but because the First World War had broken out, he was seen as a German citizen and was arrested and detained by the police, by the British police. So he couldn't come to India. So there were this is a very important collection which was not in the collected works. And I discovered that Kallenbach's grandniece her mother had migrated from South Africa, they being Jewish, to Israel, and I located these papers. And they had the most interesting stuff, including the original deed of the Tolstoy farm and correspondence around it. And there's an interesting story I should very quickly tell as a kind of postscript to the Kallenbach papers. So after I saw how rich these papers were, I wrote a note on why the National Archives should acquire them, because the Indian government is obsessed with acquiring everything about Gandhi. And I prepared a note. It was vetted by our ambassador there and by other scholars, and they wanted money. So the fee they quoted was £100,000. It was approved by the Culture Ministry, but by the time it passed from the Culture Ministry to some other ministry to the PMO, a book on Gandhi and Kallenbach came out in New York, alleging that Gandhi and Kallenbach were in a homosexual relationship. Now, the person who wrote this book, Joseph Lelyveld, had never seen the Kallenbach papers. Well, he'd seen their affectionate correspondence. He was a 21st century New York Jew who didn't understand that, in the early 20th century, people, women or men could write to each other with affection and love without a sexual connotation. He had no comprehension of celibacy because he was Jewish, and Jews don't believe in celibacy. Certainly New Yorkers don't believe in celibacy. And so he sensationally misinterpreted a reference to Vaseline. So Gandhi goes to London to negotiate for the Indians, and he says, to Kallenbach, I'm missing you. I'm in London, I'm missing you. And the bottle of Vaseline on my mantelpiece reminds me of you. And hence proceeded several paragraphs of speculation. But if he had read the full letter, he actually probably had, but has suppressed this. Later on, it talked about how, because he walked so much in London, bare feet, he got, as he did in Johannesburg, he got corns under his feet. That was the Vaseline was about. Now, this book was published, and the owners of the Kallenbach papers in Haifa said, not the lady who had them, the grandniece, Isa Charit, but her greedy sons said, hey, just think, Gandhi and our great uncle was in a homosexual relationship. Our great uncle will be in the gay pride march along with Gandhi, holograms of him will be the gay pride march next year. These are incredibly valuable. So they went to Christie and said, we're going to sell the papers there. And the Indian government panicked, went to Christie and paid $1.1 million for those papers. Had they listened to my advice, they would have saved $1 million, and some of it could have come to the budget of the holes in the budget of the National Center of the Biological Sciences. Okay. So that's the Kallenbach papers in Haifa. I'm going to end with my last find, and then I'll offer some concluding remarks. This is something I discovered in the university, I beg your pardon, in the library of the University of Adelaide in South Australia. I'd gone there to give a talk. I was interested many years in a character called Walter Crocker. who was an Australian diplomat for about 8 years in India in the 50s and 60s, and wrote the best short biography of Nehru. It's called Nehru, a Contemporary Estimate. And I was looking here and I found his diaries, which are utterly fascinating. And I'm going to read out one excerpt from the diary, which I'm not written really on Nehru, so I've not really used it in any kind of historical work. On 21st February 1960, Edwina Mountbatten died while on a visit to Borneo. So by this time, Gandhi was dead, his father was dead. Edwina was probably or possibly his lover, but certainly his closest friend and companion. And, they wrote these very moving letters to each other. As she died in Borneo on February 21st, 1960. At this time, Crocker was serving as his country's High Commissioner in New Delhi. As it happens, he was due to meet Nehru the same evening at a function at Hyderabad House to honor the famous British historian Arnold Toynbee, who had come to deliver the first Maulana Azad lecture. Now, Nehru, whatever may have been his private feelings about the death of his, who probably apart from his daughter Indira was his closest friend, had to be present. It was a lecture to honor Azad, a famous foreign minister had come. So he had to be present. And at the dinner afterwards, there was a small table where there was Toynbee, there was Nehru, there were one or two of Azad's descendants, and there was Walter Crocker, the Australian High Commissioner. And this is what he writes in his diary. He says, Nehru was there. He must have had strong feelings about the utterly sudden death of Lady Mountbatten, but he showed no signs of it. He sat next to Toynbee at dinner, and for a while was silent, but for the rest of the meal was plunged into a lively conversation with him. As usual, everyone around looked, by comparison, strained, inhibited, dim. There was not a hint of self-consciousness or fear or hesitation about him. His physical handsomeness in itself was dominating. His eyes, the golden brown and healthy skin, the healthy hair. What a man, whatever his politics. Now, I found this very moving because he had to do his public duties. Lady Mountbatten had died, but he had to attend the dinner. He had to engage Toynbee in conversation. As a historian himself, he was probably the man. Toynbee probably had accepted. Probably, with due respect, Toynbee would not have known much about Azad, and he would have accepted the invitation, possibly to get a chance to talk to Nehru, and Nehru would not disappoint him or the memory of his comrade Maulana Azad. Now, I've given you several nuggets. For more such nuggets, please read my books, or at least one of them. Now, I hope my talk has told you how boring internet research is compared to research in a physical archive. When you go to an archive, when you go to the National Archives, for example, and you order a file, or not just the National Archives, you order a file which says, non-cooperation movement 1921. Firstly, you don't know whether it will come because half the files have not been transferred. It may come back, your slip may come back saying NT, which is not transferred. Or it may come with 3 pages, 5 pages, 200 pages. The 200 pages actually may be rubbish, but the 1 page may be what you're wanting. For example, there's a tiny file in the National Archives which has a letter that Gandhi wrote when Hind Swaraj was banned by the colonial government in 1909, which is not there in the collected works. Right. So it's the zest and the joy of working in the archives. It's just in a physical archive. It's something that can't be matched by an internet archive, and I can't resist giving you one. Actually, I'll pass because I think I should leave some time for discussion. There was one quote I wanted to read, or do I have time? Or yeah, okay. Now this is the joys of archival research. Have been described by the great French historian Georges Duby in words I cannot match and must therefore quote. I quote: "I was alone. I had finally managed to have a carbon brought to the table. I beg your pardon. I was alone. I had finally managed to have a carton brought to the table. What was this box going to turn up? I withdrew a first packet of documents. I untied it and slipped my hands between sheets of parchment. Taking one of them, I unfolded it, and already I felt a peculiar pleasure. These old skins are often exquisite to touch. Along with the palpable delight, one gets the sense of entering a secret preserve. When the sheets are opened out and flattened, they seem to still the silence of the archives with the fragrance of long vanished lives. One can almost feel the presence of the man who 800 years earlier took up his goose quill, dipped it in ink, and began to form his letters at an unhurried pace, as if engraving an inscription for eternity. And the text is there before one's eyes, as fresh as the day when it was written. So, between 1981, when I began my archival research, till 2020, when the pandemic hit us, I would spend several months a year in the archives. And I had planned a trip to Delhi when the flights were banned and so on. And then I turned to my own personal archive of notes, documents, Xeroxes gathered over decades. And I realized that instead of being an archive rat, I better discipline myself, because it is kind of a fix. You want to go discipline myself, steel myself, look at what I already have, and try and make sense of it. And in some ways, that is a blessing, because there's some historians who write much less than they should, because they're so consumed by the joys of research. And I'm glad that I did that, because during the pandemic, I wrote Rebels Against the Raj. Whereas if the pandemic had not happened, I would have been going to different archives looking for that letter by Annie Besant I had not seen, that report in the Bombay Chronicle and B.G. Honeyman that had missed my attention, and so on. And had I used the internet at all, I could certainly have never have written that book. I'd like to end this lecture with a tribute to the men and women who make archives possible. I had the pleasure of knowing many great archivists, mostly in the British Library and the National Nehru Memorial Museum Library, because those are two places I know well. But they are like your archivists here, the most selfless of men and women. They're working behind the scenes with a curiosity, empathy, understanding, a devotion to the institution, and building up these collections. My book, Makers of Modern India, is actually dedicated to the selfless tribe of librarians and archivists. And I think without them, I certainly would not have written the word. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom. For taking us on this wonderful journey. We have time for questions.
You've had many careers, and I think you could also try to be a stand-up comic. I have two questions. One is, how fragile are many of these records? You mentioned something in the bowels of the Vedanta Soda.
Yeah.
Just imagine,
Yeah.
And what is being done. And the other is, the current government and maybe even previous governments have a big problem with opinions.
Yeah.
Do they have a problem with the archival record? Because the British, I believe, burned tons of papers before they left.
Well, the second question is difficult to answer, but one does not know what has been burnt or incarcerated. The British burned some and took away some. So actually, in some ways, they are fanatical record keepers. One of the reasons they produce such good biographers is that everyone keeps their papers, unlike here. Sometimes it's not fear that or anything else that leads us to dispose of papers. It's just ignorance. Right. Now, so a large collection of papers dealing with the Quit India movement and how they suppressed it, and the hostility to Gandhi in the war, were transferred to England and were actually accessed much later. And I saw them in the British Library. So, that is, clearly the Indian government, I don't think successive parties have run it. It's not so much that it is malevolent as it is incompetent. It doesn't value archives. So if you look at a state like Tamil Nadu, where the politics shifts between AIDMK and DMK. So a bureaucrat liked by the AIDMK may be health secretary or finance secretary. If the DMK comes, that person will become director of archives. That's regarded as a punishment posting, right? So I think it's mostly that. I mean, it's not always malevolence. The other question is very important about, fragility and keeping them. And this is the question of digitization. And the two major questions that I think archivists today have to answer. One is, should precious or fragile records be digitized? And the answer here is largely yes. This next question is, should they be made, these digitized records be made open to everyone around the world? And here I think I have a, shall we say, a non-politically correct position. So the Democrat, let anyone see it. Let anyone see the NCBS records. I think that's a mistake. The devotion, energy, institutional capital that NCBS has expended to make its collection. The British Library will never make all its archives available. So they'll say, here is a detailed index. So that the scholar coming from another part of the country or other part of the world knows how much time I need there. But why should you make everything accessible? Absolutely not. I think as I said, this will be seen as undemocratic. But who's done all the hard work? The British Library, the National Library, the National Archives, the NCBS, somewhere else. So prepare a detailed index, put up snippets online. So some really exciting letters by Obed or Swaminathan, right? So see, this is the kind of stuff we have. Now, what the National Archives of United Kingdom did was they started saying, okay, if you want, you can you can access X number of files online, but you have to pay so much per file. So I think that's an issue with preservation, which different archives have the different answers. And my position is, put up as many details about your holdings without the actual holdings. Yeah.
So, I really enjoyed the talk, and I have a follow-up question, actually spurred by something you said a couple of times, which is, until recently, such an archive was doing an excellent job.
Yeah.
So what has happened recently?
See, much of my experience has to do with the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. And this is a question about how public institutions survive and sustain themselves in India. And Tidmurti was very lucky to have two outstanding directors, B.R. Nanda and Ravindra Kumar, who made it, and a great series of deputy directors and archivists, and I've written about some of them, Deepa Bhatnagar, Haridev Sharma, who made it what it was. Actually, and this is the truth, the sad truth, the politicization of Nehru Memorial Museum Library and its decline began in UPA 1 and 2. I've written a long essay on this in my collection, Patriots and Partisans. It's called In Nehru's House, A Story of Sycophancy and Scholarship. And I'll be absolutely blunt about it. So, when I could tell a very long story, but it's all there in the essay. But essentially, rather than appointing a capable, qualified historian such as Nanda or Kumar, a chamcha of Sonia Gandhi was appointed, who happened to be a historian, was appointed director of Tinmurti. That began the slide. Briefly, Mahesh Shankarajan was appointed. He tried to reverse it, but then the NDA came, and the NDA had absolutely no interest in it, and it's been run by a series of politically pliant bureaucrats ever since. So the slide started with the Congress and has continued rapidly under the president.
I just wanted to know where the Kallenbach archives are.
Yeah. So they're now in the National Archives. But I can't say how well they're classified or made accessible.
Okay. No,
But they're there. Yeah.
okay, because that was kind of disappointing, because this is the bisexual week going on, and it was such an iconic thing where it was revealed that he was bisexual, and being a bisexual person myself, it was like quite shocking.
No.
So I really would want to go through the archives.
So you have to put yourself in the minds of a 19th century, early 20th century person who wants to practice celibacy. That's incredibly difficult. If you look at the history of, if you read my book, Gandhi Before India, there's a 2-page footnote on this question, which was written after consultation with religious scholars. Now, celibacy is valued among a certain section of Hindus, Buddhists, Jains, and Catholics. It is disparaged by Muslims, Jews, Protestants, and people like you and me. Okay, so it's a very complicated question dealing with your sexuality. And Gandhi and Kallenbach belonged to the former camp, and they were struggling with their sexuality. So they felt if we can overcome it, we'll be purer and more noble beings. And this is an important question. So I'm glad you asked it. They were deeply inspired by Tolstoy, who was their mentor, who was flagrantly sexual, had many children, and then became celibate. So there is absolutely no evidence that Gandhi and Kallenbach were lovers. On the other hand, there is evidence that after Gandhi left, Kallenbach fell in love and probably had an affair with someone in his office. There's also evidence, which is described at some length in the second volume of my Gandhi biography, that 15 years after taking his vow of celibacy, 13 years after taking his vow of celibacy, Gandhi fell in love with Tagore's niece and almost had an affair. So you'll have to look elsewhere for confirmation of what you want. And I wish you get it. I'm on your side, but Gandhi can't help.
Right. So it's a follow-up question to what you were saying is highly anti-democratic. So when you're saying that there is a need for gatekeeping of archives and history, who has the access to it? When you're talking about access to information, who decides that?
Everyone has access to it so long as you come there. And so long as like me, you go to the place and do the dogged hard work and not sit on your laptop. It's the difference between, remember I started my talk with Mandal, which is on the pilgrim route. Think of the person who went day by day, and now Mr. Modi's Chardham highway and plane and highway and everything, right? You know, searching for knowledge, searching for God, searching for truth requires discipline, hard work, patience, love. It doesn't come easy. So respect the institution that has collected it, that has housed it, that is, well, anyone can come, so no one should be kept out. So when you talk about gatekeeping, it's a fashionable word. There's no gatekeeping. Why don't you start your own archive and get 50 collections and let anyone come? Idmuti has done something extraordinary. What they should do, what they don't always do, is allow all non-Indian citizens and OCI members to use it with the same privileges that you and me have, which they don't, because they want to keep right. But absolutely not. It's not at all anti-democratic. It's an institution that has done it, right? It's not, and as long as they make it, you know, they would have spent immense number of man hours. I think so. I think we can. I'm happy to have a different position than yours, but I think let's have some other questions.
So I agree with you.
Yeah.
I agree that there should be some, gatekeeping of, this hard work. But then there should also be awareness of that hard work.
I agree, absolutely. That's of course. That's why I dedicated my book to the archivists. So absolutely, sure, of course. And I would totally agree with you. And that requires enlightenment certainly among governments. I mean, the British Library is a wonderful place. I'll tell you about gatekeeping. The British Library is a remarkable institution. I know it's unfashionable to praise anything British today, right? Even if you use the same resources to attack the empire, you can't attack the empire without going to the British Library. Margaret Thatcher wanted to make foreigners pay a fee, and there was a huge pushback. So, but what I'm against, maybe I slightly misunderstood you. What I'm against is totally making available stuff. Give them all the information they're required to know when they can come, what are the hours, where it's open, what facilities they have.
Hi. I wondered if you could speak to individuals who are neither historians or archivists, but happen to collect and systematize a lot of work because they're participants in a movement. One example, where there's E.S. Reddy, who would neither be classified as a historian, perhaps, or an archivist. And I wonder if there are more examples, so you can talk about such people.
So E.S. Reddy was, in my experience, in a class of his own. So E.S. Reddy, for those of you who don't know, I'm glad you asked that question. In fact, that's the first one, talking about dedication, the first volume of my Gandhi biography is dedicated to E.S. Reddy, was a person with some relatives actually in Bangalore, including a scientist or two, as it turns out. He was from Andhra, went and joined the UN, started the anti-apartheid cell there, was a hero of the anti-apartheid movement, organizing international campaign against apartheid. Then he retired and he started building the world's greatest private Gandhi archive, which he made accessible to everyone and is now, of course, publicly available. And he was quite remarkable. You know, I think his selflessness and accessibility is quite remarkable. To go back to the question of gatekeepers, individuals are generally gatekeepers. Historians are incredibly possessive. They don't give their archival files. You know, for example, when I was writing column of Foreign Field, I heard that there was a letter between Ranji and W.B. Yeats that he had been in Ireland or something. And it's an obscure part of Yeats's life, but the Yeats biographers would not even give it to me, right? Now, I also might not give stuff which I've got and collected. Right? So, but Reddy was exceptional. And you won't find others like him. But what you will find is people who make the collection and they donate it. So I think, and what I must say on this, on the question of selflessness, I think it's quite selfless of the MS Swaminathan Foundation to give Dr. Swaminathan's papers here and not house them there. You know, I think that's it's a tribute to NCBS, but it's also a sign that they wanted it not just there, but you know, some other place.
I know that was a really, really entertaining talk. And you mentioned a few things about the joys of working in archives.
Yeah.
I was wondering, do you feel that there are certain vacuums in archives, especially in India? What would they be? What are some of the biggest vacuums or gaps or flaws?
Yeah. That will require not another lecture, but a conference. I do organize a call some people and we can have a good conversation. So I do this, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe a couple more questions.
Thank you for that inspiring talk. I have 5 questions. So one is about the twist of a researcher or a historian to work with fragmented archives. Because you already brought it out.
Yeah.
Even Gandhi's archives were in so many different places.
Yeah.
I think I'm building on a conversation with Venkat where he said the onus also is on the researcher.
Yes.
How much you dig and how you connect the dots.
Yeah.
So what role does the archive play or archive building or an exchange between archives play from your perspective?
Yeah.
The second is going back to fieldwork. When you said objects don't talk or documents don't talk, but the talking is equally important because of the issues of representation that are coming out again and again in published books.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I mean, they're both very important questions. The first is, I think it's good that this conversation is going on with the NCBS and other archives. From the perspective of individual, a fragmented archive about the subject you're working on makes it more arduous, but also more interesting. So my advice to young scholars, particularly those who finished their PhDs and got their jobs, is don't try and finish your next project quickly. Sir, ये 2 साल में हो जाएगा सर, मैं ये लिख रहा हूँ, इसकी जीवनी लिख रहा हूँ 2 साल. I said take 5 or 6 years, maybe 10, because you don't know what will come up. Particularly a biography. If it's a very simple thing, you know, the history of NCBS. If someone is writing a history of NCBS, they'll come here, they'll use the archive, they'll talk to lots of people, they'll get critical perspectives, adversarial perspectives, adulatory perspectives, foreign perspectives, subaltern perspectives, and write it, right? But if you're writing a biography of, like, say, the biographies I've written, you know, the stuff is all over the world, right? The person who asked me this question was someone who wanted to write a book on Manmohan Singh. And he said, you know, there's some papers here and the family might talk. I said, there may be papers in Washington, there may be paper in Geneva, there may be stuff in Hoshiarpur, there'll be people who remember him from Amritsar, there'll be people in Oxford. You look at his college records in Cambridge, his college records in Oxford, publishers' records, please. The British record on when he was finance minister, you know, 2 years you want to do this book. If you want the book to last, spend 5 or 10 years. Because Manmohan Singh deserves it. He's a fascinating, interesting character, right? So in that sense, it's a challenge, but more exciting. I'm glad that in the 2 biographies I did, I spent so much time because, you know, you don't know, some clue leads to something else and leads to something else. The other question you asked about was about representation, right? No, of course. I mean, that's an issue that is much more directly confronts an anthropologist or sociologist. You know, I think that anthropologists and sociologists are much braver human beings than historians for 2 reasons. One is the methodology. It takes, one of the people in the Indian intellectual community, one of my all-time heroes, living, younger than me, since I'm sometimes accused, partly with justification, of only praising older men who've been dead. One of my all-time heroes is Nandini Sundar, the anthropologist. Though, of course, she's also one of my favorite antagonists, and we argue all the time, and we argue tomorrow also probably. But because of the courage, to go to Bastar year after year for 20 years, right? But so that's one part of the courage that a sociologist has. But also that moral challenge of representation confronts them much more directly. Because I can make jokes about Kallenbach and Pyarelal, but I never saw them. But you have your subjects whom you've interviewed, shared meals with, shared stories with, had encounters with, and then you have to write about them. You can anonymize them, but that isn't, how much does that help? So absolutely, it's a real issue. It's also an issue for historians, of suppression, diversion, ideological bias, and of course, for a historian, the archives must give you the clues. Archives will always surprise you. There is no such thing as Marxist history, let me tell you clearly, or Hindutva history either. Because if you are a truly proper archive writer, sincere and inquiring and diligent archive writer, the archive will make a mess of all your ideological presuppositions. So you have to look at that. But in that sense, anthropologists, as I said, that's why I have great admiration for people like Nandini Sundar, because it's not just the intellectual quest, but their moral anxieties are also much more complicated than they would be for a historian like me.
So my question is now, these generations are like using more of the social network to kind of communicate, or less writing, and even if they communicate, it's like a few words, Twitter and stuff. So would the historians who are going to come like in a decade after will find very difficult to interpret the personalities of this generation, what they are reading, what they want to convey and stuff?
So that's a very good question. I'd say this, that they'll have to be more agile on their feet. Twitter and Facebook and YouTube clips are archival resources for a future historian. I was born at a time when you had basically printed stuff and a few, oral histories and so on. If you were a radical, you did oral histories or looked at newspapers and not just at government records or written documents. Now there's all kinds of stuff. What would a biographer of Donald Trump do? He'll have to start with his Twitter account, because all the rest may be destroyed. Right. Whereas I was lucky with Gandhi or anyone else. Right. Or so absolutely. So, but it just that would be a primary source. It would be and I don't know whether there are people archiving stuff like this. Emails which are, say a biography of Salman Rushdie, who certainly deserves a biography, both for his work and for his life. What kind of sources would you use, right? So I think the young will rise to that challenge. I think, in that sense, probably what my talk was a little bit about, days gone by, but those would also, they would have to be interpreted with care and understanding and empathy and judiciousness. And you would still have a printed record too. So you can't ignore it completely.
We could keep doing this, but maybe we can go.
Yeah, Zach.
Just one last question. So you made archival research sound a bit like spending a week with Santa Claus and getting gifts every day. But have you had any really exasperating experience or extremely disappointing experience in an archive?
Of course.
It happened to you?
Many times. But you learn to live with it. Of course. But of course you have it. You go, the archive is closed, they don't show you stuff. They keep the file. But you have to keep at it. It's a 5-day test match. You will keep at it doggedly. And by recognizing, Jack, every work of history is incomplete and impartial. And of the time, it's that sufficient. It's not, a perfectly elegant theorem or whatever else. So that's obviously, it's the joys and the frustrations and the doors being closed. I had to wait. Again, I can talk at length, but I talked about Pyarelal. Pyarelal, the effort it took for me to get the Pyarelal papers opened. I think I started the journey in 1996. It took 11 years. Right, and now they're open for everyone. Talking about anyone, but because I went to Nagpur, I met Pyarilal's sister, Sushila Nair. She refused, then she died. Then I wrote to the nephew in New York. Coincidentally, but this is talking about stories and not stand-up comics, but anecdotes. Pyarelal, the Othello guarding Desdemona, gave a few scraps to Attenborough for his film and said, I'll vet the script. But you must give my nephew a role. The nephew was a kind of struggling actor in New York, and the nephew plays Godse. He comes to bigger. Okay. And it was to him that the papers were bequeathed. He had nothing to do with Gandhi. He had nothing to do with anything. Pyarelal had no children. His sister Sushila had no children. I tried all kinds of ways. And finally, I was able to get Tinmurti to, anyway, Tinmurti, finally they're there available. So it took 11 years. So you would find all of that. But ultimately, you must go on and always remember. I said something about why a scholar, some young scholars are impatient. But nor should they delay too much. There's no perfect history or biography of anything. Even something small as and modest as the NCBS. So at some stage, you must say, I've got enough new and interesting material. I have an original, perhaps compelling argument. I have something new to add to conversation that is not lightweight, that people read with some and get something from it, and maybe start a debate and go and publish. So that sweet spot, you've done enough, not too little, too much, but you'll have, and know that someone else will come and write something more interesting, different, from a different perspective, and often possibly better than yours.
Yeah. So Rama is absolutely fascinating. But I just wanted to end with a final comment. I think Archive Act is very much like a laboratory lab. Exactly what you said at the end about discovering things, taking long time, and spending the time that is needed, and yet knowing it's going to be incomplete.
Yeah. Thank you. But I wish all biologists had that suitably modest view of their profession. And I have in mind particularly two American biologists whose surname started with the letter W. I worked that out. We leave that. He's maybe more cautious, but I have. Wilson. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Thank you so much, Ram, for taking some of them. Thank you all for joining. There are questions outside. And since you mentioned it, do keep an eye out. We will be launching Professor Swaminathan papers on October 11th. So we hope you're able to join for that event. Thanks for being here.